Can history truly prove everything? Can the tools we use for, say, understanding empires or battles, can they really nail down something that feels well, a bit outside the usual historical box?
Yeah, it's like this ultimate collision point, isn't it? Between the historical method and claims that touch on something transcendent, maybe?
Yeah.
How do you even start applying the historian's usual toolkit to something described as, supernatural?
Exactly. And that exact tension, that's really the core of our deep dive today. We're
Correct.
digging into this specific, fascinating question. Just how far can history go in proving the resurrection of Jesus? It's almost a test case for the limits of historical investigation itself.
Mm-hmm. And to help us navigate this, we're leaning on insights from an article that really unpacks the views of Dr. Dale C. Allison Jr. He's a very well-respected New Testament scholar, known for being rigorous, balanced, but also, crucially, very historically minded in his approach.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack Dr. Allison's perspective from this material, understand his main arguments, what he thinks history can support, and exactly where he draws that line between historical analysis and what might be faith or theology. So get ready to maybe think a bit differently about what proof even means when we look way back into the past.
Well, the first thing Dr. Allison really stresses right from the get-go is this foundational idea, the absolutely critical, maybe unbridgeable gap between theological belief and historical proof.
That feels like the essential place to start, right?
Yeah.
Because history works within a certain kind of framework, evidence, probability, cause and effect, stuff we can grasp through, well, human experience and natural processes.
Precisely. His point is that history, just as a discipline, as a way of knowing, it's simply not equipped to confirm a supernatural event. A historian, they can look at sources that claim something supernatural happened or analyze evidence around those claims like, was a tomb found empty, or did people genuinely believe they saw something extraordinary?
But they can't write in their history book. And then God intervened and raised Jesus from the dead. That's not a historical finding.
That's exactly it. Declaring God raised Jesus is fundamentally a theological statement. It needs a theological framework, not just historical data points. And this leads to a concept that's really central to Allison's thinking, something you see crop up again and again, epistemological humility.
Okay, epistemological humility. Sounds kind of like being humble about what we can actually know, especially using these specific historical tools.
That's a really good way to put it. It's about recognizing the built-in limits of our historical knowledge, especially when we're dealing with unique events or claims that just don't fit neatly into typical historical cause and effect explanations. It's basically acknowledging that the historian's toolbox, which relies on probability, comparing sources, looking for parallels, it has boundaries. You can't really use it to achieve metaphysical certainty.
Okay, so that defines the boundary, what history, just by its nature, can't definitively prove. But Allison's work also highlights what history can credibly tell us about the whole situation around Jesus' death and the start of Christianity.
Yeah.
What is sort of within history's reach here?
Right. There are definitely points that Allison and actually, much broader scholarship see as historically pretty solid. Like, for instance, the fact that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, that's about as close to historical certainty as you get for anything in the ancient world.
Okay, yeah. A very firm historical anchor point there.
Yes. And another key point is that his followers came to believe they saw him after his death. Now, this is crucial. History can confirm the existence of that belief. There are reports of appearances circulating among early Christians. That happened regardless of what physically occurred or didn't occur. The belief itself is a major historical phenomenon with huge consequences.
So history can confirm the powerful belief, the experience people reported, even if it can't verify the actual, physical event behind it. That's a key distinction.
It really is. And also, history tells us about the early persecution of Christians. Now, for Allison, this historical fact, it speaks volumes about the conviction of those early believers. I mean, they were willing to suffer, sometimes die for this faith, which definitely included this belief in appearances. But again, this proves how strong their belief was, not necessarily the historical truth of the resurrection event itself. People have been persecuted for all sorts of deeply held beliefs throughout history.
That makes sense. You can historically verify the impact of the belief, the reality of the belief, without necessarily verifying the thing they believed in.
Exactly. Now, while those points seem to rest on pretty solid historical ground, Allison becomes much more cautious when he looks at some of the other traditional elements often tied to the resurrection claim.
Ah, okay. So this is where the historical picture gets more complex, more open to debate.
Precisely. Take the empty tomb, for example. Allison acknowledges the arguments for it might be maybe slightly stronger than those against it, but, and this is key, he emphasizes they are not definitive. And why? Well, because the ancient sources we have, they aren't like modern, objective historical reports. They're often late, sometimes they seem contradictory, and their main goal wasn't just neutral fact-finding, it was proclamation, theology, making meaning. That kind of evidence naturally leaves room for historical doubt.
So the very nature of the sources makes it really tough to get conclusive proof.
Absolutely. And you see the same kind of challenge with Joseph of Arimathea's role in the burial. Allison tends to view it as probable. The details show up fairly early in some traditions, but he stresses it's still open to dispute. Again, we're working with very limited information, and details could have been shaped over time for various reasons, maybe legendary developments or theological points they wanted to make.
And what about the post-mortem appearances themselves, the things the early Christians believed they experienced? Allison says their actual nature remains open to interpretation.
Yes, and this is really critical. He looks at the possibilities that historians or psychologists might raise. Were they perhaps psychological phenomena like hallucinations brought on by grief and expectation? Were they maybe more like spiritual visions? Or something else entirely? From a purely historical standpoint, based only on the ancient reports we have, we just can't definitively choose between those options. Those reports tell us that people had experiences they interpreted as seeing Jesus, but they don't give us the kind of data we'd need to, say, conduct a differential diagnosis across 2,000 years.
Huh. So even if we accept that people had powerful experiences they took to be appearances, a historian can't really verify what those experiences objectively were, physically or metaphysically.
That seems to be his position, based purely on the limits of the evidence we possess. For Allison, dealing with this kind of evidence means historians have to rely on probability, not certainty. And often, that probability assessment is going to be very, very low for any claims that require specifically supernatural explanations, because historical method tends to favor natural explanations when available.
Okay, so let's talk about a line of reasoning you often hear, especially in apologetic circles. The argument that the resurrection is simply the best explanation for all these historical facts. The disciples' sudden transformation from scared to bold, the claims about an empty tomb, the rapid rise of the church. It's often presented as the simplest way to connect all those dots.
Right, it's kind of like using a Sherlock Holmes model, isn't it? Eliminate the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And many argue that the resurrection, while maybe improbable from a naturalistic view, is the least improbable explanation for the whole package of phenomena.
So how does Dr. Allison engage with that kind of best explanation logic?
Well, he fundamentally questions whether that Sherlock Holmes model really applies effectively to ancient history in the first place. He points out that the evidence we have isn't like a complete set of clues from a perfectly preserved crime scene. It's sparse, it's ambiguous, it's open to multiple interpretations. It's not like finding a unique, undeniable fingerprint at the scene.
So he's basically saying you can't confidently rule out other possibilities to arrive at just one best explanation.
Exactly. He emphasizes that alternative explanations do exist, even if they might seem less compelling to someone who's already inclined towards belief. He mentions things like body theft, which, interestingly, was a known concern in antiquity. There's historical evidence that guards were sometimes posted at prominent tombs precisely to prevent that. He also points seriously to hallucinations, noting that psychologically, they are plausible reactions to intense trauma, grief, and fervent expectation. And, importantly, there are widespread reports across cultures of people experiencing visions of the recently deceased. These things happen.
That makes sense. I mean, human psychology is complex and can account for some pretty powerful subjective experiences.
Yes. And this brings us to what might be his most significant critique here. Allison argues that when the historical evidence is this pliable, this ambiguous, our conclusion often ends up depending less on the raw data itself and more on our starting assumptions, basically, our worldview.
Ah, okay. So it's really about the lens we bring to the evidence when we look at the past.
Precisely. He's been quoted saying something very much like, "What we bring to the evidence fundamentally shapes what we conclude from it." If you start with a worldview that's open to or expects divine action and supernatural events, then yeah, the ambiguous evidence reports of appearances and empty tomb story might strongly suggest a literal resurrection to you. But if you start with a more naturalistic worldview, one that assumes events happen within the known laws of nature, you're almost inevitably going to find the alternative non-supernatural explanations more historically probable, simply because they don't require positing something extraordinary, something outside that natural order.
Wow, that's a really profound insight. And it applies to so much more than just this specific topic, doesn't it? It kind of challenges all of us to be aware of our own interpretive frameworks whenever we're looking at complex or ambiguous historical data.
It really does. And actually, expanding on that idea of appearances, Allison is apparently quite fascinated by cross-cultural reports of visions of the recently deceased. He finds this parallel phenomenon really interesting to consider.
So, looking beyond just the specific Christian accounts, at similar kinds of experiences reported across different cultures and different time periods.
Exactly. And in studying these kinds of reports, he notes that many such visions are described in similar ways, often brief, usually silent, maybe just a fleeting glimpse. And frequently they are private subjective experiences, not really verifiable by anyone else.
Okay, so how does he connect that observation back to the early Christian accounts then?
Well, he suggests this could offer a plausible historical context for understanding some of the differences we see in the early reports. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul just lists that Peter saw Jesus, but gives absolutely no details. Allison kind of wonders, based on these common reports of visions of the deceased, maybe Peter's experience was something like that. A brief, maybe silent, non-narrative encounter. A fleeting vision that just didn't lend itself to being told as a detailed story.
Ah, I see. So the type of subjective experience might influence how detailed or how story-like the report of it eventually becomes.
Exactly. And you can contrast that with, say, the gospel accounts of appearances to Mary Magdalene, which are elaborated into much more developed narratives with dialogue and action. This might reflect how different traditions over time gave more narrative weight or theological significance to certain figures or certain experiences, shaping the stories in ways that are distinct from maybe a raw, fleeting visual experience.
It's a really fascinating layer to consider how the reporting or the storytelling around an experience can evolve and take shape.
And for Allison, these kinds of analyses really just reinforce his core point, that these experiences were undoubtedly real for the early Christians on a subjective level. They genuinely, powerfully believed they saw Jesus. But from a purely historian's perspective, this tells us primarily about their powerful belief and their subjective experiences, not necessarily about the objective historical fact of a physical body coming back to life.
Okay, so putting all these pieces together, the source we're looking at describes Dr. Allison's overall position as a kind of middle path. He's clearly not fitting neatly into the usual boxes here.
Yeah, that's the characterization given. He's definitely not a mythicist. I mean, he doesn't deny the historical existence of Jesus or just dismiss all the early accounts as pure legend. He takes the historical sources very seriously.
Right. But he's also explicitly not an apologist, at least not in the sense of using historical methods to try and argue that the resurrection is a historically proven fact that should compel belief in everyone.
Precisely. His middle path leads him to what can be, frankly, a challenging stance for people on both sides. He asserts that, based strictly on the historical evidence we actually have available, both belief and disbelief in the resurrection are historically reasonable positions to hold. The data itself, as he reads it, simply isn't conclusive enough to force one conclusion over the other.
Wow. That requires significant intellectual honesty, doesn't it? To really look at the evidence and say, you know what, this doesn't compel everyone to see it the same way.
It absolutely does. And that intellectual honesty, combined with what seems like a deep respect for the inherent ambiguity in ancient historical sources, that really seems to govern his whole method. He's not primarily trying to win an argument for one side or the other. He seems to be trying to honestly understand the limits of historical knowledge and wrestle with the pliable nature of the evidence itself.
So based on this perspective then, what are the key takeaways from Dr. Allison when it comes to the resurrection?
Yeah.
What's the bottom line?
Well, his view seems to be that the resurrection functions primarily as the theological and narrative truth within the framework of Christianity. It's what gives meaning and structure to the faith.
And how do most people actually arrive at belief in it, in his view?
He suggests, pretty straightforwardly, that for most believers throughout history and today, their faith in the resurrection isn't primarily grounded in analyzing historical data. It's grounded in tradition, personal experience, community, upbringing, which, if you think about it, is probably true for how most people come to hold most of their deeply significant beliefs.
Yeah, that sounds right. And bringing it back one last time to the purely historical question.
He maintains that the historical data itself is simply too pliable, too open to interpretation, and ultimately insufficient to compel a single conclusion, whether that's a definitive historical, yes, it absolutely happened exactly as described, or a definitive historical, no, it absolutely didn't. The evidence just allows for too many different plausible interpretations depending on the worldview and assumptions you start with.
So it sounds like his approach isn't about denying the possibility of truth or avoiding the question, but about being rigorously, maybe uncomfortably honest about what historical methods alone can actually achieve when faced with such claims.
Exactly. It really comes across as a deep commitment to the limits of historical inquiry, and alongside that, a recognition of the dignity of multiple perspectives when you're dealing with genuinely ambiguous historical puzzles like this one.
Taking this deep dive into Dr. Allison's specific perspective on the resurrection, it actually gives us a much broader lens for looking at history itself, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Understanding the inherent limits of historical proof, especially when you're dealing with unique, maybe one-off, potentially supernatural claims, that's actually a really valuable lesson for anyone trying to make sense of the past. It teaches us critical thinking, sure, but also a kind of necessary humility when the evidence is patchy or incomplete.
Yeah, and seeing how a serious scholar navigates really ambiguous evidence and respects the fact that different interpretive lenses can lead to different yet still reasonable conclusions. That's a skill that applies way beyond just this topic. It helps us evaluate any complex historical event or even, controversial claims we run into today where the facts are debated. It just underscores that history isn't always about finding one single, simple answer.
It really highlights the interpretive work that's always involved in understanding the past and how our own starting points, our own positionality inevitably play a role, especially when the data isn't perfectly clear-cut.
So let's maybe leave you, the listener, with this to think about after our conversation today. Given Dr. Allison's analysis that the historical evidence for the resurrection isn't really sufficient to compel everyone to the same conclusion, and that belief can be heavily dependent on the worldview we get into the data, how does recognizing these limits of historical proof potentially change the way you might think about faith? Or maybe even how you evaluate claims about other controversial events, past or present, where the facts are hotly debated and different people seem to arrive at wildly different conclusions looking at seemingly the same information?
It really challenges us to look inward at our own assumptions as well as outward at the evidence itself when we're trying to understand complex issues.
It really does. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into what is truly a fascinating intersection of history, faith, and the limits of knowledge, seen through the very insightful lens of Dr. Dale C. Allison Jr.'s work.
Yeah, we really hope it's offered you maybe a new angle, a new way to consider historical evidence, the crucial role of ambiguity, and how deeply our own perspectives can shape what we ultimately conclude from the past.
Keep exploring those limits. Keep questioning those assumptions. Thanks for listening.